Chartered Bank. So welcome everyone to the closing session of yet another very successful summit organized by the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce that pulled out all the stops when it came to a wide-ranging highlight of penetrating issues and challenges, and brought out a lot of discussion and dialogue, founded on the platform of the theme this year, on the fast track to a turnaround. These 2 days have highlighted these issues and challenges, as well as the decision-making that has to be done very fast if we are to make a comeback and if we are to turn around as it would be needed to meet the global challenges as well as make our presence felt in this region. So to give you a synopsis of the issues and also the findings of these last 2 days, I would like to invite the Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, to the podium. Mr. Tyagaraja will be presenting the findings of these last 2 days to the Prime Minister so he can take a look through while he presents it to you on the stage.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As we come to the final session of the 2-day summit, it gives me great pleasure to summarize the contents of the past 2 days, also for the benefit of the Prime Minister. And then we will invite the Prime Minister to make his observations, followed by a panel discussion with the membership at the head table. So the theme of the summit was on the fast track to a turnaround, identifying the need and urgency for Sri Lanka's economy and development to be fast-tracked. My presentation will highlight our findings from the summit, taking a synopsis of the key recommendations, the polls results from the audience during the last 6 sessions, and some key quotes from our various resource personnel. We felt at the outset of this summit that Sri Lanka was at the cusp of a turnaround when looking at some of the macro numbers with the improvements in exports, FDI, and reserve over the last 12 months. But also we felt in the first part of this year there was a slower local economic growth. There were some emerging challenges facing us both locally as well as globally, especially, and also the limited space available on the fiscal end due to the continuous focus on fiscal consolidation, which again we felt it was timely to examine the opportunity of this turnaround and revolve the conference of the summit on this theme. The session initially delved into the macro elements of the turnaround, and we had the Honorable State Minister of Finance, Iran Wickramaratne, Dr. Etteri from the IMF, and Ms. Anubhuti Sahe from the Standard Chartered Bank, presenting their analysis from a three-pronged view of our economy. The strong panel discussion followed, where the need for breaking the historic cycles which Sri Lanka economy has been facing over decades were identified. And Sri Lanka has always gone round and round in a turn and was perceived to have missed out on the opportunity to go forward. So again, that was a key takeaway. The first plenary session identified that the external factors made Sri Lanka even more vulnerable. In particular, the fact that the major 4 central banks worldwide had literally half their injection of liquidity into emerging markets and plans to even slow down further next year. And also the increased protectionism and inward-looking policies of some of the major economies again felt that, and also in the context of a rising global oil price scenario, we felt that there were some external vulnerabilities which had to be taken cognizance of. So the sentiment needed to be relooked at with a clear communication strategy by the government that provides the government with political predictability. And here again, while long-term solutions to improve growth without resorting to stopgaps was an important thing, especially with an election coming up in the next 12 months, focus on also micro-level structural changes was an important thing, and the repeat feeling that the need for a cohesive, clear communication strategy between policymakers and the general public and stakeholders was underscored. Also with the fact that at this particular forum, it was felt that the single most important enabler which would take long-term positivity towards turnaround would be the need to reform the public sector. It is not something which is a short term, but it's a medium to long term perspective. The polls results saw the majority of our audience indicating that the economy was not perceived to turn around in the next 12 months. A reflection once again of the sentiment or mood in the economy. While policy consistency was identified as one of the crucial factors for driving this turnaround, external factors were also expected to have a bigger say than domestic factors, as was articulated in the poll. The summit then looked at the 7 or so pillars, the levers which was felt that would be important in driving this fast-track turnaround, which is highlighted in this particular slide. And then we moved on to session 2, which explored some of the bigger levers, such as the port city and Hambantota in shifting gears. The session also delved into the role of the Sri Lankan brands and the need to empower rural economy. I think that was a very interesting case study of SPA. The SPA is SPA Ceylon, which started as a SME, despite facing the various domestic challenges, saw it fit to scale up and develop a product, a solution in excellence in a small market like Sri Lanka, and then translate this and replicate this in 14 other markets. So it was a good message for SME Sri Lanka that nothing is impossible if the right vision and focus is available. A few key recommendations from that session was to move away from a buyer-driven market access to a producer-driven network. And center to this was also the appeal that engagement with policymakers should not only be confined to the exporter section, but should also take into account domestic manufacturing and local trade as well, which forms a part of the total value chain which supports the producer-driven network. Sri Lanka needs to plug in to the niche markets by developing stronger brands, was certainly highlighted by Charlene Balasuriya. The polls results in this session indicated a mixed result with an even split of those who agreed and also disagreed that the government had a comprehensive plan for fast-track the economy. An overwhelming majority felt that the government will not be able to deliver reforms to fast-track economic growth and development. Maybe this also can be connected back to the earlier sentiment that a clear communication strategy should be in place to improve the awareness of some of the good things the government has been doing to the general public. The most crucial factor in driving this turnaround is expected to be capacity building using transformational technologies. I think that came out very clearly with 43%, which was also, I think, revalidated by some of the findings which were quoting Professor Ricardo Hausmann's the work which he had been doing on behalf of the government. So it revalidates that particular point. A significant lever for the government as well as the private sector was transforming into the digital economy. We got our private sector to have a twofold discussion. This particular session had two elements to it. One on the new models for digital economy, and the other to look at the older established businesses and to see how well they had internally calibrated themselves to transform their companies into meeting the opportunities of digital economy. Again, many pointers came out from this discussion, such as the need to modify employment laws to keep in check in the digital economy, needs and the role of e-government development activities can do to unlock growth opportunities. So again, there were some requirements to the policymakers. Audience poll again shows more need to be done in terms of education and the generative conducive policies for entrepreneurship to create more international organizations. This morning, the summit went on to discuss trade, investment, and services. The key points from this session, while the focus is on trade agreements, we must also get our domestic house in order to be able to gain from the efficiencies from these agreements. As pointed out by Dr. Nihal Pitikala, Sri Lanka may be gaining from trade tariffs in bilateral agreements, but when you look at what those respective countries have achieved with other countries in other agreements, it appears that the preference was more in the agreements and the benefits which the countries have commanded with other nations, which means that Sri Lanka was perceived to be in negative preference. And that was articulated by Dr. Pitikala in a particular index during his presentation, which again underscored the importance that while free trade agreements are important, that alone is not adequate. The resilience of the underlying economy and the businesses is equally important. Some interesting quotes from this session. I think Dr. Rajat Kathuria from the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, ease of doing business gives more of a bang for the buck compared to a 10% reduction in tariffs. As an example, sophistication of Sri Lankan exports have not increased since 1991, Dr. Nihal Pitikala, which seems to also be reinforced by the Kaufman findings. The poll's results in this particular session again points out that sequencing on trade liberalization isn't done well and that national trade policy should support the private sector growth. We dedicated session 5 to involve the Sri Lankan bureaucracy, and it was very important to see how best bureaucracy could be energized. But what came out of that discussion was not the need to energize the bureaucracy, but to re-engage the government as part of a private-public engagement with the private sector. And the outcome from this was that we need to look at re-engineering and reinventing the bureaucracy with the latest technology, develop criteria for measurement of efficiency. It came out very clearly from our Indian colleague, Mr. Vishwanathan, that applying performance measurements applicable to the private sector in bureaucracy could lead to a disaster, because it's a unique proposition and the measurement criteria need to be unique to the public sector. There was also a feeling that Sri Lanka is entrenched in a past bureaucracy that is not ready to work at the needs of the 21st century. That came out during the discussion. Would like to point out some of the key quotes. I think interesting to note a comment made by Dr. Samarthunga, the Treasury Secretary. For every 100 rupees, we appear to get rupees 44, or 44 rupees is spent on public employees. So the cost, the burden, and the opportunity and the need for improved efficiency was stressed. The polls result indicate that there is a clear need for KPIs and a rigid appraisal mechanism. And then we had the session before this. For the first time, we invited 6 of the chambers of various backgrounds to sit in one forum with the Ceylon Chamber and discuss issues which are common from a national agenda perspective. Perhaps 3 things which came out which are worthy of a note. One was the need for a peaceful environment for people to live, work and do business regardless of ethnicity or racial divide. The second thing is the need for policy consistency, and a cry for the government and policymakers to engage with the chambers more when crafting trade policy and trade agreements. So those were 3 important takeaways. And from our perspective, we would like to present 3 important messages to you, Mr. Prime Minister, which again came out from the 6 or 7 sessions. The first is the importance of consistency in policy, relentless focus on execution, and the need for a clear, consistent communication strategy between the government and the general stakeholder relationship. The second is the need to drive micro reforms also to steer a turnaround, and a message that the private sector is with you and the government and committed to drive this turnaround agenda. And it is willing not to resort to short-term measures, but it also needs an understanding by the government and a commitment to also implement policies which are conducive for long-term benefit of the country rather than for short-term. So those are the summary findings which we would like to present to you. And now may I invite you to make your observations.
With those main takeaways in mind, I'd like to invite the Honourable Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, hopefully for some responses to what we've heard the Chairman presenting. Mr. Prime Minister.
Chairman and friends, the general practice is for the chief guest to open the sessions and you have to end it. Now it's come the other way around and you are telling me what exactly we have to do. I will tell you what have been our objectives. Those, I think, have been clear. So there have been questions about some of the policy measures. That is, competitiveness and exports will solve our debt problem. If not, we are going to fall into a debt trap and we'll be in it for a very long time. We took on the challenge in 2015 of tackling the debt and not get overwhelmed by the debt. We had early elections because the previous government could not handle the debt and the revenue was insufficient even for debt servicing, forget about paying the salaries. It's from that perspective we have to look at the overall economy. What have we achieved so far is macroeconomic stability. But to hold that macroeconomic stability and to go forward, then we have to become competitive and export-oriented. This is what we have to remember. In 1990, when I was, again I go back to the theme of the Minister of Industries, our export earnings was $2 billion. Vietnam was $2 billion. Bangladesh was $1.7 billion. Today, if I ask you how much our exports are, as you said here, it's nearly close on 12 billion. Bangladesh, 35 billion. Vietnam, 165 billion. That is the difference. We can talk of war. But remember, Vietnam started after a war from 1945 to 1975. 30 years lost before the start. We lost some time on the war. But the South grew. Your 200 garment factories, and the biggest zone came during the during the war, except for Katunayaka, Biyagama, Sitawaka, Koggala, 200 garment factories, Kandalama, all that came during the war. So we can't say that they came after the war, yes, but we had a build-up. Nevertheless, let's take into account that war was over in 2009. And what are we in 2019? Where will we be? That is the major issue ahead. Everyone applauded when there was growth just after 2009. And what critical I remember of even Harsha De Silva and others who said this is short-lived. And that's what happened. Because if you look at Vietnam and you are looking at Bangladesh, they are both becoming more and more competitive. Bangladesh started with apparel exports, the ones at lower end than Sri Lanka. Today their merchandise exports as a percent of the GDP is going up. It's the same with Vietnam, which in 1990 imported rice. Today the second largest exporter of rice. Addition to coffee. And of course, what many of you know, pepper, which has been in the forefront of our discussions, both the domestic market and India. But we have had significant foreign borrowings, but they were not invested in activities with high growth. All we have got is an expansion of our non-tradable goods, while the export sector stayed static. So now we have to go ahead. We have a debt to service. We managed it so far. We have about nearly $4 billion for next year. But we can't go on and on and on. At some stage, we have to change our balance of trade in our favor. We have to increase our exports and bring down the deficit. So at this stage, we've achieved the first round. That is stabilizing the macroeconomy. Now comes growth. Stabilizing the macroeconomy can be done by the bureaucracy. It can be done by the treasury. It can be done by the government machinery. It's how the government controls borrowing. What's our fiscal policy? Interest rates. But now comes the next stage, which you all are involved in, the growth. So it's in this background that we have to remember that by 2025, we should have a positive record, and we can be sure that debt is behind us. That we tackle the issue of debt, it certainly will be less than 60% of the GDP, maybe 55%. That's where we have to work together. What have we done so far? Have we been on target? But there has been the question of communication. As far as stabilizing the macroeconomy is concerned, yes, we have. I would say we had problems with the drought, which affected the rural economy. In getting the next round of reforms through, no, we have been a bit behind time. I think about 6 to 8 months behind time. By now, we should have many of it through. We are still talking it over and getting ready for the next budget. But that is not the only issue that we have. We are focusing more to catch up on part of the lost time. We still have to bring in part of the reforms. As you know, we got in a new tax structure which raised its own complications and is now getting sorted out by the next budget. But we are looking at how we move ahead. Bureaucracy moves slower, and certainly you have to pass through more hurdles as there are more ministries. That's the cost of stability. At least you have a stable environment, and whatever we do will not be reversed. That's what we are building on. So now we are working around a single window for investments. And to bring that in by law, I think as far as the bureaucratic structure is concerned, we have done the work, but we want to bring it in by law. An investment law, which will include the single window, which will look at some of the aspects of ease of doing business. To identify some of the key departments and boards that are unnecessary and focus on them. But these bureaucratic changes are only part of it. Is how do we go ahead? Where do we build on? Our first problem is the limited exports we have. Our products are limited. Tea, apparels, and solid tires. Until we get out of that framework, doing all other measures will not give us success. How do we move out of that framework? How do we go ahead? Firstly is to focus more on tourism, which is a short-term game. And attract foreign investments, whether we like it or not. We have a certain capacity to go into new areas. But if you get the foreign investors, they'll expand the products you have. It's not to wipe out the Sri Lankan sector, but to go ahead. Look at Korea. Its expansion is due mainly to Vietnam. Vietnam's expansion is due mainly to Korean investors, followed by Japanese, followed by Chinese. and FTAs. That FTA with EU, FTAs with Japan, with Chile. Now look at our position. We are the GSP plus. We can export 6,000 items there. Can we find 60? 6 we have finished, yes. But do we get 60 items, big items being exported in general categories? Let's say apparels are divided into many categories. No, we haven't. So we got one opening there which we cannot even utilize. Secondly, we have the FTA with Singapore. That also gives us opportunities. Can we utilize them? Why are we looking at Chinese investments? Because they will expand the range of products and they will bring in their own markets. So we have to look at products. If you are looking at manufacturing especially, we have to design both on domestic as well as foreign investments for expansion. So that is where our focus is. First, how do we attract the investments? As you mentioned here, the infrastructure, yes, it's not merely Hambantota or the port city, it's one stretch of infrastructure from Kandy to Hambantota with number of free trade investment zones. We haven't started any after about 1994, no large zones. Now we are working on 3 at the moment. Altogether we planned out 5, Hambantota being the largest. But we are going through a process of acquisitions, which that's the most time consuming. For our connectivity, we are still working on the Central Expressway, because under the new laws, we have to pay the compensation before the Exim banks start giving us the money. We are completing that process. So that part 1 and part 3 will come in, giving us a road, the way to Galagadara. Hope I spoke to the Chinese of starting section 1 sometime next month or month after. So let's look at the connectivity. Let's look at the fact that we will have 1 new harbor, 1 new airport coming in. But those who are going to move in there, I don't think are going to be Sri Lankan firms. With some of the foreigners that we bring in, who will start off there. Next are the skills. How do you train the skills? The question mark there is, what are the skills you need? What are the factories that are coming? Until you answer that question, you can't answer the rest of it. But we are looking at a skills development program at the future, talking to you. Then, whether we get the foreign investor or the local investor in, the incentives. So now we have the incentives, which includes land. The only sector now left behind, which I will be meeting in the next few weeks, is the knowledge sector. The IT and all, we have working out a good package for them. So most of your tax issues, I think the Treasury told me they are discussing with the IMF team in here. But that's a program that will end in 2019. From there onwards, we are on our own. We can't be running back to the IMF. We can't be like a patient who gets on to life support the moment they feel like it, like others take a drink in the evening. That is just not on. This time it's going to be a hard journey, and we have to be ready for that. So as we open out, it's, as I said, more difficult than stabilizing the macroeconomy, because it's members in the government, how much they spend, how we cut down their capital budgets, how we constrain their spending, where we go. Those are internal debates. The debate here is more. The debate within the private sector of where we go and how we go. Within the private sector, there is a big debate about the Singapore FTA. When you go into the country, it's not a major issue. There are more pressing issues like transport, cost of living, jobs, and the drought. So how are we to work together? We have discussed with the export sector because they have to lead in the diversification. But there's nothing called export economy and import economy. It's all together. And the domestic market industries today must also be the exporters of tomorrow. So first, look at how do we become competitive. We are looking at trade adjustment. In this period, tariffs per se we have not brought down, as we said. Para tariffs, yes, we have to move out because that was the major issue of cost of living at the last election. Para tariffs, cost of fuel, the artificially high rate of fuel. Those are two major issues. But there is the need for the local industry to adjust. So now we put out a trade adjustment package which the cabinet has approved, and we are up before the chambers to discuss. Whatever help you want to become competitive, whatever we want to do, will help you. We can't achieve all this overnight, but we have to have a stretch period. Someone told me 50 years. I said by 50 years, there won't be your industries anyway. Let us be much more practical workers. We are willing to come and we realize you can't allow these domestic manufacturing industries to go down. They are the biggest employment creator in this country. Just as much as we have to keep some part of the agriculture going. So we need it. You all are the ones who are there in the difficult times. So let's make that journey together. More than the exporters, I want to talk to the domestic market. I understand that as well as you do. And how to help you all, how we work together. I have had discussions with some of the leading members of the private sector, and we hope to have discussions with all of you in the chambers. Thank you. You have put one of our achievements down as democracy, but I thought you want us to be dictators. I think on the political side, we can be satisfied. On stabilize the macroeconomy, yes. But to hold it, we have to go ahead. You can't stay in the same place. Now that, all of you have to be there in together. So, both the government and the private sector to learn to speak with one voice. Some of us have most of you tell us the government doesn't speak in one voice. I want to argue with you, you are a coalition. But you all are not coalition, you are the private sector. You can't be able to talk with one voice. Within this framework, let's see how far we can go and how fast. There are issues of interest rates, exchange rates. We are looking at it, but we also have to keep an eye on the global economic landscape. It was not what it was 6 months ago. So keep that in mind when you move ahead. We may not move fast as I would like to move, or you would like to move, but nevertheless, it's better to move slowly, but nevertheless, where we are going. It's not an easy journey, but having seen the Sri Lankan private sector, having seen the Sri Lankan economy, I think we are in a very good position, as you say, the strategic location. And niche markets we can develop. There's tourism, but more than that, into the other service sector, the knowledge industry, the IT, yes, how do you train them? Our first issue is, even before we encourage the enterprises, how do you get the training institutions going, and how do you back it? I don't think you should depend on the government. As government, we can fund the students who come, we can give them very soft loans, we can give them grants, but I think, but in my view, the institutions must not be government, and it must all be able to respond to the changing markets in the field of the knowledge industry. So there's much more to be done. I don't want to take any more of your time. I will go through the recommendations, and we will be meeting with you all also regularly. And as you said, we need a platform where the issues with the bureaucracy, at least with the major departments, let's identify 10 of them, can be resolved for you all as we go on. We have hundreds of departments. I won't at the moment say that we'll tackle all, but let's take the 10 that matters most to you, and monthly meetings can cover those sectors together with the secretaries of the key ministries. This, I think, is a way forward, because now we are in uncharted territory. Doing the macroeconomy was not so difficult. This is the challenge, and you have to go together. Can't be done by the government. It has to be done by you all and by the investors we bring in. So let's reduce the delays, reduce the heartaches, and see how we can move forward together. I don't want to take any more of your time, but I thank you for the advice and the deliberations you've done me.
After that address, I'm sure that has set the stage for a very interesting panel discussion for the closing session, so I hand over the chair to Mr. Rajendra.
Thank you very much, Saitri. PM, thank you very much for those concluding comments. Again, the reason we put in democracy as a positive, because the fact that during the last 2 days we had unfettered constructive criticism and a dialogue with some of your government officials and ministers was because of that enabling environment. And I think that due recognition should be given. We're also very happy that in your remarks you recognize that exports alone cannot go as a sector, that it is the entire value chain, and the importance of domestic manufacturers and the domestic industry has to also be taken into account. So that's greatly appreciated, and it came out as a concern across the last 2 days. The recognition that one needs to also engage with the bureaucracy is well taken, and we welcome your comments that there will be an opportunity for an ongoing dialogue with the chambers. So that's something we will certainly look forward to in giving our inputs. And I think we also recognize the same way you do that to transform and leap, it's not about pushing plain vanilla business, but that transformation, the adoption of transformation technologies, as well as looking at a much greater granular, diversified export is an important thing. So we certainly are in the same space. I would now like to pose a few questions to our 3 fellow panelists, Hans Vijayasuriya, the Vish Govindasamy, who are members of the leadership panel, and Jim McCabe, the country head of Standard Chartered, who has been not only a fellow member of the executive committee of the chamber, but also a great supporter of the Economic Summit for now a few years. So let me perhaps start off with Vish. Vish, yesterday our keynote speaker Arun Kumar in his keynote address highlighted the importance of export diversification and reaching out to ASEAN and other trade blocs via developing strong economic partnerships. We have to date signed an FTA with Singapore, and now certainly we are going through a review process a few months after it. As someone involved in value-added exports, do you think we are in the right mindset for regional cooperation agreements and plugging into ASEAN? Or are we intimidated by differences in size when developing such partnerships?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Tia, and thanks, Honorable Prime Minister, for being here with us this afternoon. I think the topic of FTAs has been spoken quite a bit between yesterday and today at different forums. What I would like to say is, regardless of what the feeling of the FTAs between the different factions, whether an FTA is required with Singapore or whether we are ready to go into the ASEAN or the other, the larger forum, There are, like the Prime Minister said, maybe the macroeconomy is put right, but there are lots of other smaller things which we discussed this afternoon with the bureaucracy. Those things need to come right. As private sector, while the export is an important thing, and like what the Prime Minister said, the domestic market is equally important. We went through a whole series of issues, first the war, then the tsunami, etc. And we were resilient. Through all this, our businesses grew. Even now, we are somewhat resilient and ready to take some of the external shocks, whether it's the oil price increase, whether it's the exchange fluctuation, the weather. I think it was discussed that Sri Lanka is going to be out of the 10 most affected countries in the weather change in the next few years. So we somehow get through all this. But where we struggle is the unpredictability of some of the policy decisions that comes from the government from time to time. So whether it's to be ready for an FTA and to go forward, we need policy consistencies. We don't need quick shocks. For lack of words I'm going to say, the glyphosate issue that was put on the agriculture sector, which set us back almost 2 years. Now, it's important that the government feels that a price control is necessary in the healthcare sector. That's the government's prerogative. But can it be done overnight, through a gazette notice? So I think we need to grow up from all these things to be a more mature economy, to handle external shocks than be put to internal shocks regularly. So I personally think FTAs are a good thing, need to be discussed more openly and look at the benefits, and like anything else, FTAs also will come with negatives. We have to overcome those, and the Singapore FTA is probably the easier one that we can get through so that we can move on to the ASEAN and the other one.
Thank you, Vish. A question to Hans. Hans, in session 2 yesterday, discussion revolved around the suitability of levers available to moving this economy from slow to fast track. Empowerment of the rural economy was one of such thirsty areas identified. Given that telecom and ICT have been two areas which have world over empowered rural economies through connectivity, could you identify the most relevant policy reform in this space which could further energize our rural economy?
Thanks, Thia. If I may, with your permission, take a step back from the point of view of economic growth. A strong belief I have is that no economic growth, or indeed the sustainability of economic growth, can be achieved if there are asymmetries or disparities, and to that extent, very stark disparities between, put it crudely, the haves and the have-nots, or one district of the country and another. And these asymmetries could be in terms of access to knowledge, it could be access to basic communication, it could be access to trade, commerce, or general participation in the larger economy. So I would think that we need to consider this problem and the opportunity beyond the scope of the rural economy, but our economy as a whole. Going back 25 years, when I think the incumbent finance minister was the telecommunications minister in this country, I think he made several policy decisions which have held this country in great stead over the last quarter century. And this was to liberalize the connectivity sector. And here I'm talking about the electronic communication or electronic connectivity sector. The result, today, telephony is no longer a scarce or a luxury for the population of this country. 130% penetration of mobile phones, even if you take it that every citizen has 1.5 to 2 connections, you're talking about 80% of our adult population is connected. Approximately half of this connectivity is in the form of data and broadband. So today you would have at least 50% of our population connected on data. Now, why is this significant? Connectivity or crude basic connectivity in terms of being able to make a phone call, being able to access the internet is a thing of the past. I think we all accept that this asymmetry has been erased due to good policy making by successive governments of this country, and also private as well as public sector investments. Now, what is very important is the next phase, where we need to give consideration to what can flow across this communication or this connectivity. And there we get to the subject of Industrial Revolution 4.0, a subject which was discussed at great length at the World Economic Forum recently, where our Honorable Prime Minister was also a speaker. These technologies actually could level asymmetries across multiple sectors. We could be talking about smart agriculture, smart transportation and logistics, smart fisheries, where relatively inexpensive technologies riding on the internet, which has now been made available, affordable to nearly every citizen in the country, could revolutionize the productivity across multiple sectors of our economy. So how the rural economy, or our economy, I would say even the macroeconomy, could accelerate would be dependent on the availability of basic connectivity and also the availability and propensity of services, applications, and automation which ride on this basic connectivity. The end-user surplus, I would go back 10, 15 years as computed by McKinsey, was a factor of 4 in the case of basic connectivity. Means that every dollar you invest in basic connectivity, including more people in the connected economy, the end-user surplus or economic excess would be 4 times or $4 to the economy for every dollar put in. It is predicted that with Industrial Revolution 4.0, with the new technologies of cloud and multiple methodologies to accelerate and equalize the progress of sectors across developing and developed countries, that this end-user surplus could be represented by a multiplier of high as 10x or 10 times. So for every dollar that you put in, what the outcome to the GDP could be 10 times. Switching quickly to the policy environment, like I said, right policies enabled our basic connectivity to flow and for us to be a much more connected and equal nation. In the next phase, what needs to happen, I believe, my personal opinion is that some attention needs to be given to the areas of commerce, financial services, because money flows would eventually determine the inclusion which we can drive across multiple sectors. If our rural citizens cannot be paid, if SMEs in every corner of this country cannot receive electronic payments, if the participation of our citizenry in the digital economy is limited to the 4% of credit card holders that you have today, then we will not have a broader and plural participation in what IR 4.0 or the digital economy could drive. And for this, look at countries like China or India, even large countries like China and India. Electronic payment has become mainstream, where someone traveling in China would know that WeChat Pay, if you don't have a WeChat Pay account, you can hardly survive in a marketplace or in the wet market or even in a trader environment. That's because it has become mainstream. So there are some policies, regulations, which maybe the government can look at to make these transactions less, or make them more friction-free, frictionless, and also to have regulations which encourage every citizen of this country to enter this new era of what I would call Industrial Revolution 4.0.
Thank you, Hans. I think talking on Industry 4.0 and the need of pushing electronic payments across the country, I think there is a preemption to that, which also is the need to bring in electronic KYC identification in onboarding customers. Because as we are embracing digitalization, if the last post is still not digitalized, the benefit of efficiency will really not get to the consumer. Do you see a need for reforms in that area as well?
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point here. That,
for example, if I can just pin you there on India, for example,
correct.
With biometrics, they have really gone and driven Aadhaar in a very big way, whereas every village,
correct.
Not only payments but even government services are now energized, but the local merchant can actually provide those services. Do you really see the benefit of that sort of thing being rolled out in this country?
Absolutely. I think I missed that out in one of the key policies or implementations of policy which our country can benefit from. This was first mooted back in 2012, I remember, through the ICTA. And I think a lot of great work has been done by the government, and we are close to implementation of a digital ID. But the digital ID will be the single most important entry ticket for the broad citizenry of our country to participate in a digital economy. And once you have an irrefutable digital ID, which cannot be forged, it's biometric, then you would find that every citizen could be potentially incorporated as economic entities into the larger digital economy. They could receive payments, they could establish their identity wherever they are. And another important aspect of this is that the welfare system, there's no getting away from the fact that Sri Lanka has a great tradition and a great strength in free health, free education, range of subsidies across sectors to drive growth. Now, half the problem is that these economic assistance doesn't necessarily get to the right people. Now, with digital identity combined with electronic payment mechanisms, which hopefully reside on the mobile phone, doing a little marketing for the mobile sector, then we could have a situation where every single citizen has an electronic payment account and could receive subsidies. They could establish their identity, be entitled to cheaper health or free health, and the money that the government of Sri Lanka invests in welfare could be targeted and directed at the right segments down to a single citizen. And this, I think, would create an economic surplus which could be reinvested for growth in other areas.
Thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Jim, you know, the speaker last morning from the port city outlined the strategy of investors and compared it to making a glass and then finding the water to fill it. And that was and there were certainly some who expressed concern whether the port city would become a ghost city similar to those several cities in China. You know, representing a global bank with a very strong presence in Asia Pacific, how do you see this development, and would you have any message for the government in improving the attractiveness of port city once it is completed?
Thanks, Tia, for that. Honorable Prime Minister, thank you for being with us this afternoon. I think Sri Lanka can and must become a hub for this part of the world. There's over 2.5 billion people living in this region. Today, more than 10% of them are of a middle or upper class level. And if the required legislation is put in place for this port city, it will become, that'll become its incentive, and it will facilitate this project and definitely prevent it from becoming a ghost city. And the glass will not need filling, it'll fill itself. So, you know, we must catapult Sri Lanka into a regional center status and break down those barriers that prevent it, because it will revolve in an important transfer of technology and innovation. It's going to be a significant source of employment and skill building. Large value creators for this country and for the region in areas such as education, health services, research and development centers, regional headquarters for many types of corporations, MICE activity, and even financial services. So I think we must embrace it and not fear it. I think the benefits, it's in a parallel manner. It's not in competition with the rest of this country. And so it itself will become a catalyst for other foreign direct investment over a very long period of time.
Thank you very much. Vish, on the aspect of value addition and exports, yesterday we heard the story of Charlene Balasuriya and Ceylon, where they showcased their success in as a manufacturer of Ayurveda-related products as well as a spa operator. And I think he very clearly articulated starting life as a SME, which is very important given that the engine of Sri Lanka is still very much SME. And despite whatever challenges he faced during the past decade, relentlessly pursued excellence in developing that product, tweaked it to what he felt the end user was looking at, and then transplanted and replicated this model into 14 markets. Why, in your opinion, are more SME success stories not forthcoming in this space? And what can policymakers do to assist in such value-added growth? Because this very much is the need of the hour, push for value-added, but not just exports. Why aren't there more spas coming in?
Thanks, Thea. I think, first of all, I think Ceylon is an amazing story for Sri Lanka, and they have done extremely well. There is enough opportunity for all the SMEs to do the same. I think Enterprise Sri Lanka that has been launched now by the government is obviously going to help that trend. But like what was said this afternoon, while we encourage and we are able to lend to some of the young entrepreneurs, we must also have a very strong mentoring program for those entrepreneurs to make sure that their business plan is executed to the T, and they don't just go astray halfway without it. Because being an entrepreneur is a challenge by itself. I mean, the mindset, the number of hours that you need to put, it's not a 8-to-5 job when you're an entrepreneur. It's a 24/7 job. I think we need to have our education system, the schools need to talk about that. I think, again, I'm referring to some of the sessions that was discussed. The mentality of the young students coming out of our universities is to get a Andwe Rasawa. We need to get out of that syndrome. We need them to be entrepreneurs. They need to be wanting to work in the private sector. We, the private sector, must be willing to go to these colleges, universities, and explain what it is to work in a private sector, what it is to be an entrepreneur, invention, development of brands. These all can be discussed. One of the impediments I see, in value addition and value creation is while the successive governments have come and done different things over the years, one of the things as a businessman, as a private sector, we have not been able to reform our labor. The labor reforms have been stagnant for the last 25 years. If you look around the world, we need to move forward in our labor reform, especially for the SME sector to go forward, the IT sector to go forward, different sectors. So the labor reforms need to happen rather quickly. So, Tia, the answer is ample opportunity. I don't think there's any more excuse with Enterprise Sri Lanka being launched. SMEs need to come forward And we, the bigger businessmen, should take the role of, and the chambers should take the role of mentoring these young entrepreneurs.
Thank you. That's a very clear message, I think, the role the chambers can play. Hans, another question to you. You know, the participations in the poll for session 3 showed that 58% were of the opinion that our current education system will not produce the next generation of skilled workers required by business. What can the private sector offer the government in partnering to build the skills gap rather than lamenting? What can we do?
Exactly. I think we have a lot of work to do in the private sector itself. And I would say that one is base skills that our youth imbibe during their university or secondary education. But a real fact of today's knowledge economy and the digital economy in particular is that your base skills don't matter very much any longer. What you learn in university would be redundant within 5 years. The workplace of IR 4.0 or the workplace which will accompany the new digital economy is going to be something completely different. And as members of the private sector, I think we have a responsibility to lead the way in this transformation of the Sri Lankan workforce. Take a simple example, and with respect to gender. And I believe we would all agree that we lose a large proportion of our female workforce during the 30 to 45 age group, because young mothers find it very difficult to manage high-powered private sector jobs while looking after kids, helping them with their homework, going to school, etc., etc. Now, with today's technologies, there's absolutely no reason why we cannot create 4-hour jobs, 2-hour jobs, 8-hour jobs which start in the evening, etc., to bring back this large population of female professionals back into the workforce. I'm just giving one example. So likewise, we need to be agile in the way we structure work and the way we structure the workplace. We need to work 7 days a week, not by making people work 7 days a week, but by creating jobs to fill up 7 days and maybe even 24/7. So this kind of agility which the private sector can generate could really bridge this gap to a large extent. Could we help with training, retraining? Yes, again, I think it's our responsibility. And are we prepared to take into our workforce youth who have the right attitude, but not necessarily the right CV? This, again, is something which Silicon Valley would have taught the rest of the world, where the success stories there, not necessarily the right CV, but the right attitude. And in each of our companies, I think we can take a lesson from the new digital economies where attitude has made the difference. The new technologies would assist this, enable it, cloud, connectivity, everything we were talking about. And it boils down to the fact that if we are to drive economic growth, we need to bring our entire citizenry into the picture. They need to be a part of this, not just all of us in this room or not just the employees of our companies. We need to somehow engage every single citizen. One might say that in the developing countries, we don't have those innate skills at the bottom of the pyramid. But I think the pick-me story is a good one, where there's a lot of skepticism. Would our average trishaw driver join the digital economy and be able to take a booking on a smartphone? And I recall at the time, there was a lot of skepticism across even the digital community. But we were proven wrong. And today, the most humble of trishaw drivers is using one form of ride-hailing app or the other. Likewise, the retail sector, the small kades and mudalalis across the country, my personal experience is that for the last 15 years, they have been carrying out electronic transactions. And this again defied beliefs at the time that our rural entrepreneurs would not go digital. They are digital. So there's nothing wrong in the innate skills of our people. I think they will match any economy in the world. It's how we embrace their capabilities and empower them to deliver of their best.
Thank you. A question to you, Mr. Prime Minister. During earlier deliberation, there was a view from sections of the audience that in promoting exports in overseas markets, that we could make a better use of the embassies, especially the commercial attaches in key markets, to effectively promote and lobby in these key markets. Is there something we could do to enhance the capacity of that particular cadre?
We've, I think, together with Ricardo Hausmann, done a training. There are some people who've completed successfully from different branches of government, Foreign Service, Department of Commerce, BOI. So you got a handful. But if you are looking at diversified exports, I think you've got to have the people from the private sector going out. Maybe government helping them with some form of funding, but that's no replacement as far as the embassies are concerned short term. Even in some of the foreign embassies here, I note, they are involved more in pushing large projects through. But now we haven't the capacity of that. We are looking at small exporters. Sometimes bringing in a foreign investor who has already got a market is far better. Otherwise, we back our people to go out and bring the exports in, for which we may have to have a program where we share costs with the private sector.
Thank you very much. Jim, another question for you. Again, the audience poll at the end of session 2 yesterday revealed that almost 50% felt that the single most important factor in driving this economic turnaround was the need for policy consistency, while 35% felt it was the need for policy implementation. Again, as a major Asia-centric global bank, can you identify perhaps 3 quick wins for Sri Lanka in delivering in this space to regain the public and investor confidence?
Thanks, Tia. Late last night, when you told me you might be asking me this question, I went back and checked my job description, and providing the Prime Minister of this country with policy advice wasn't on that. But I never shied away from answering a question, so let me take it from a slightly different angle. Thank you. Quick wins. Yes, I agree. I think we have to regain confidence. We have to regain the decisiveness, right or wrong, of this economy. And I'd like to suggest one way to go about it. We have many projects that are pending right now around the country. RFPs were issued quite some time ago. They were very enthusiastically responded to by large numbers of global and local partnerships. And so I'd like to suggest that we take a bunch of them that are quite important and make them all happen. They're ready to go. There are people ready to go. They've been ready to go for a long time. And I think this would create a huge confidence boost in Sri Lanka. You know, I'm talking about a power plant, an expansion of the airport, a refinery, a oil or fuel pipeline that's presently leaking, maybe the East Terminal Port, which is sitting there ready to be used. Even the Water Board has a PPP out now, and there's many others, I'm sure. Why don't we just do it and get these out there, be diverse, inclusive in the way we assign them, but assign them. Those types of actions in a short period of time will truly create an important change image in the minds of the I think local and global communities. Won't please everybody perhaps, but the vast majority, and I think it'll have a big positive effect long term for Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Another question for you, Prime Minister. I think we certainly welcome, and I think a number of chambers as well as the audience welcome the launch of Enterprise Sri Lanka. From an educational reform point of view, would you like to make some observations on what is in store within the education system to develop more entrepreneurship at the school and the university level, at that level, which will also hopefully reduce the dependency level of these people looking for employment?
I think the school level, a major reform will be introduced in the upper secondary vocational stream, which we've got from Finland. But it's going to take some time. You've got to train the teachers, you've got to prepare the syllabuses. My focus more is a school is good for a general education, primary education, maybe up to 13. But if you are looking at people then going out into the world of work, we have to depend on institutions which are not government. There are some government institutions, technical schools, like the two institutions in addition to the Morato University, the two vocational institutes that are good. But if you look at it in the outstations, no. The standards are variable. So it's a question of how does the private sector get involved in the post-school work. On the other side, we are also reorganizing the youth corps. So we give some basic training, attitude training in the youth corps, and then put them on to the private sector for the rest of the training, and we share the cost or we pay the cost. But you have got to think anew with all the digital economy coming in. Some of the type of brick and mortar institutions may no longer survive. So we've got to think anew on training, and let's put our money into getting the basics done in the school.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question on the FDI and the investment. You know, there is a view that Sri Lanka is positioned from a locational point of view to benefit tremendously from the Belt and Road Initiative of China. We have already seen some moves in that direction. But there are also others who appear to be wary of the Chinese BRI. As the leader of the country, how would you, in the next few years, look at engaging the BRI as an opportunity while also preserving sovereign interests of the country?
We look at BRI as an economic project. And BRI has mainly been, for many countries, funding infrastructure. But we've got to the next stage. We've done the infrastructure. We've got the Hambantota Harbour going as a PPP with China merchants and the SLPA. Now you've got to create the hinterland for the harbour. Now that's basically going to be FDI. The same with Port City. So let's focus on these two projects, which is the next stage of bringing in FDI. We've done the infrastructure. In the road buildings, we have finished those. And we meet that FDI to repay the debts we have incurred in building the infrastructure. Not only the debts we have incurred from Exim banks and of China, but also the bigger issue is paying the international sovereign bonds. So as far as we are concerned, this is just one of them. And I think once we get this moving, we are also going to pursue Japan, India for investments. So let this be a start. We are not stopping anyone else. It will make Sri Lanka that much more attractive. There are some of the other investments coming in from Japan. As long as we don't allow security issues to come in, there shouldn't be a problem with the Belt and Road Initiative. We've told that to the Chinese government appreciates it. We're both looking at this as an economic project.
Thank you very much. I would now like to just invite perhaps concluding brief comments from each of the three panelists, maybe for a couple of minutes each, starting with Vish.
Thanks, Tia. I think in conclusion of the fast-tracking turnaround, we have heard from yesterday where we have to diversify our exports, Our labor force, which is 1.4 million strong in the government sector, now needs to look outside, and we need to re-energize the private sector employment and see how we can train the newer workforce that's coming in. I spoke about the labor reform, so there is more productivity-based employment in the private sector. How do we engage the bureaucracy in getting whatever the private sector needs to get done? Those are the things I think that came out very strong. And also the different sectors working together and engaging each other in going forward. I think that's a summary of the outcome. I'm sure we have given a very comprehensive document to the PM, and we can continue to engage with the Prime Minister's office going forward.
Thank you. Jim?
I think of following on Vish's words, the theme "Better Together" is, I think, what we should focus on. The partnership between the public and private sector. We can sit there and feel this way or that way on either side, but it's time now to do this and collaborate and to meet halfway and deal with imperfections and just move on. There's just so much potential out there. We've got to grab it, and we're only going to be able to do that if we're working together. And I think that's really something that will fast track or certainly improve the environment in the near term.
Hans?
Yeah, I'll first echo Tia's view right at the beginning that indeed the open dialogue, debate, and very constructive generation of ideas over the last 2 days exemplifies the fact that we have a strong democratic foundation, both across the relationship between government and the private sector, as well as within the commercial environments. I think what's key and what came out throughout these discussions is clearly there is a turnaround. We are at the cusp of substantial economic growth. Then the question is whether we can grasp that opportunity and whether we can gear it up to deliver much, much faster than it appears to be at this point in time. So there are many levers to acceleration, and I think a lot of great ideas have been generated by the very eminent speakers over the last 2 days. And Honorable Prime Minister, we really look forward to the support of the government in activating some of these acceleration levers, and you can be assured of our support both as a chamber and as a collective private sector to make this happen.
Thank you, Hans. A final observation and a comment from me to the Prime Minister. I think while we had a very good round of deliberations from an economic turnaround, again, one of the concerns which was articulated earlier in the chamber was the need for the preservation of law and order to make sure that businesses and the ordinary citizen would be able to live in peace, in harmony, and without being marginalized or affected by any form of ethnic or racial divide. And I presume that we have the assurance that law and order will be applied throughout the nation without being.
Yes, we are applying law and order throughout the nation. The number of crimes that have been detected have increased, and the crime rate actually has come down. So overall, there has been improvement, though media has to highlight deaths, murders, suicides, accidents for sales.
Thank you very much. That now brings this summit, 2-day summit, to a conclusion, and I would like to hand over the proceedings to Savitri to do the final round.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister and to our panelists as well as our moderator for a very interesting and a conclusive end session of the Sri Lanka Economic Summit 2018. I'd like to invite Mr. Thiagaraja as Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce to present a thank you to our chief guest for this closing session, the Honourable Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Prime Minister makes his way out, we would like to say a big thank you to each and every one of you for making this summit extremely successful. We do hope you will gird yourself with that determination and commitment to make our country that much better and put it on the fast track towards transformation. We will see you next year.